Which one of you is true?
Forget that one's off. So that's a live mic.
Oh,
But that's the live camera.
I think you meant that.
I want to see some PowerPoint.
Oh, I see. My bad. My brain's trying to auto.
Yes, it
Oh.
does that. I want to see what he's showing.
All right, everybody. So welcome to American Judaism on 1 foot, or how to cover 500 years in an hour. We have a little less than an hour, and I did a little less than 500 years because I realized that number one, I think there's something to be said for the fact that once we get into certainly the middle to late 20th century, this is actually the experience of people that are part of our community. So it felt a little strange to try and explain to people what their experience was from that perspective. So I'm really gonna focus on Judaism up to the end of the 19th century, just about. And the reason I'm gonna focus on that also is because, well, three things. People's experience, as well as the fact that once we get to the 20th century, that's actually the history that most people know. And it's actually the history that often when we think of Jewish history, we imagine, which is large groups of immigrants. Go ahead.
The second wave was like 1880s, 1890s, something like
yeah,
that.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's when just herds.
Yeah, so we have, and we'll talk a little bit by the end of by 1850s, we have a pretty significant Jewish population in the United States. But as we move forward, right, once we get into late 1800s, early 1900s, is when we have the wave, especially because of violence in pogroms and violence in Europe. And that's really the history that a lot of us know and have learned about. And so I really wanted to focus on the earlier stuff because it's maybe we have bits and pieces, names, that sort of thing. But I think it really sets us up. And I think it's an interesting place to stop because it gives us a moment to think about the cyclical nature of time and what's going on and thinking about our personal experiences now. So that's my caveat. If you were hoping to get all the way through today, bless. All right.
Yes.
So before we actually even start talking about it, I do just want to sort of, because this is the first part of this project, right? I know that you've done some thinking about what history means and why we're doing this, but I want to think about it some more. So this is actually the first book that was published by JPS, the Jewish Publication Society, in 1890, called Outlines of Jewish History, by a British woman named Lady Katie Magnus, which is surprising for lots of reasons. But this is the very first book that JPS puts out. JPS has gone through multiple kind of manifestations, and this is one of them. And I point this out because the selection at the bottom is actually from the book. And I just want to read through it real quick. So this is from talking about the history of the return from exile. The first task of the exiles when they arrived at Jerusalem was to set about the rebuilding of the temple. There were some very old people in the crowd who had worshipped in the first beautiful temple, and to them the scene could not have been one of unmixed joy. The Bible says the old men wept, but men old enough to remember and to weep over their memories could not have been many, and hope and rejoicing were the chief feelings on the occasion. And the citation actually isn't in the book, but I put it in for you. So this part that she's talking about is from Ezra 3:12. And what I love about this is sort of this dual notion of reverence for history, as well as skepticism. And so this gets to this question of history as we study it today versus the past. So history as a discipline is relatively new, especially history as we understand it. And that's because of a lot of reasons. one is certainly access, right? The imagining that we have the ability to search things online obviously is not something that Lady Katie Magnus can imagine, that many of the people we're going to talk about today could imagine, even if they had encyclopedic knowledge of Talmud, for example, right? They didn't have access to records in the same way. Many things weren't discovered until much, much later, right? So understanding links was not necessarily something that we would get until archaeology became what it was. Think of the Rosetta Stone or something like that. But more than just sort of the practical logistical pieces of it is this idea of sort of a reference and an understanding of biblical history as truth. And so this is 1890, so this is relatively late. And so skepticism is maybe a little bit more okay, or a little bit more understandable. But certainly up to this point, we have many Jews who are taking, well, there was a garden and there was a talking snake. And and so it's always been a push and a pull between this idea of we believe this and we take it seriously and we take it literally. And so history in this way is a mixture, especially up to this point, of what people told me, common belief. And so the idea of doing history, really digging deep, thinking about context, trying to understand, always has its problems because we're interpreting something that has happened and finding through lines that may or may not be true, just like probability, right? Ice cream sales are up in the summer and there are more car accidents. Therefore, more ice cream equals more car accidents. It's just not true.
Right.
But
causation, not correlation.
Causation, not correlation, yes. And so we try to be more sensitive to that. We can make better guesses about certain things. But this what and why of history is very important and has continuously and continues to change. What's going on here? And with that, I can't help but bring up Mordecai Kaplan. And so, right, so as many of us know, Kaplan defines Judaism as the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people. And what I think is important to point out is, right, there's this scientific sense of evolution and the historic sense of evolution. And one thing that's interesting about this Inscribed project is what we, in a sense, are doing with evolution, right? With scientific evolution, it's a lot of chance, right? Right, primordial ooze, something is a little wonky and we get a tadpole, right? Like I'm being sort of glib about it, but this is a scientific sense of we can't always understand how it's happening or why it's happening. That's obviously changing, right? As we've understood with things like climate change, right? We have tools that help us understand things better. But when we're talking about sort of historic understanding, one of the things we're trying to do with this project, to my understanding, is think about where we've been and where we could go, which is something that obviously a bacteria or a cell doesn't have the capability of doing. Along with this, right, history gives us a sense of perspective, of context, of course, of appreciation. I often think of, there's sort of you can have like a pessimistic, nostalgic orientation, which is to say everything was terrible then, everything's so much better now, or the golden days, right? We can use history as sort of a foundational thing and give over to it. But I think thinking of it more as raw materials, in many ways, right? They don't come without baggage, but they are really there to be played with and understood as voices, which is again part of our tradition as the Talmud, right? We have people talking across millennia, but seem to be in conversation because that's how the Talmud is set up. And so we're sort of trying to do that same thing. The past gets a vote and not a veto. And in order to understand not just that they are giving a veto, but why they're giving the veto that they are, is an important and worthwhile project. So before I actually launch in, I'm wondering if anybody wanted to, I'm gonna put my hands down, so I'm a gesture and I'm like blocking. I'm like, hello, my beautiful hand.
Check out the Manny.
I would, I'd love to hear what people are thinking in terms of what they're hoping to get out of this project and kind of if you have a different understanding of history that you want to bring in, because I think it can be multiply defined, certainly.
What I was just Googling on my phone was when On the Origin of the Species came out, because that was 1860-ish.
Yeah.
So that JPS book was 1890-ish, right? So it's been out a few years, but it's still pretty not like
Yeah.
Joey's saying interested in more history and more learning for me.
Perfect.
That's a dittos all around.
Yeah, that's a dittos all around.
Yeah.
And just kind of, I love the way you put this, is where we've been and where we're going makes it not evolution through chance, but evolution through knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And that ends up being
Mm-hmm.
really sort of an important difference that makes us human,
And
makes us really,
when did we reach that point too? When did it it feels like there was a pivot at some point? Where we were evolving through evolution, like developing, and then
yeah,
we got the Industrial Revolution in a way. Before that probably, but
yeah. But also I think that there's something to be said for the fact that Judaism has always put an evolution through knowledge first, and
Yeah.
and societal second.
Mm.
Like, to some extent, you have to know something to decide something.
Yeah, and that's why we started.
And that's I mean, you've got to study the Torah and Talmud to understand where we were, so that you can discuss how we are going to face this now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was what Talmud was all about, was understanding how we're going to use what we have to guide us through what we're dealing with now. And part of what we're dealing with now is a huge change in a lot of what society, like a lot of societal norms are shifting.
Mhm.
And that can be really good. That can have, it's like science. Science is a tool.
Yeah.
Science is not a religion, it's a tool.
Mhm.
And we have to decide how we're going to use science to better or not.
Mhm. It's like science and at least Reconstructionist Judaism are evolving together. We learn more, we integrate.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so
And
we're not
that's-
stuck in the past like some people.
And that's that's what other cultures are coming to Judaism to learn
Yeah.
too.
Mhm.
Is, I mean, because this is not just about Judaism really, but other cultures. I mean, the story of the Dalai Lama coming to the rabbi in London to find out how do you be resilient and deal with the idea of being a strong cultural religious community in a diaspora.
Yeah. How do you deal with exile? It's
Yeah.
something we've kind of gotten good at.
Yeah.
And I do, just as sort of like an even keeling, right? I don't want to suggest that there's like I don't want to suggest that we can remove ourselves either totally from our context, right? That's like the highest, hubris, if you want to call it hubris or privilege, whatever it is, right? Our choices are certainly constrained, but I think that there is a greater things like access and a different perspective on history certainly give us tools to make choices that are informed differently and have different values to them, right? And I think that that's really, really important.
And broader perspectives. We're getting broader. People are realizing, okay, the person who won that got to write that story. What about everybody else who was involved in that situation? What's their perspective?
Yeah, Walter Benjamin,
finally.
history is written by the victors, right?
Absolutely.
Certainly.
And that idea that now that we have more information, we need to utilize that to make better decisions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Not prejudices.
Thanks everybody. Did anybody? I don't see any chat on the thing, so
Nope, I'll
I'm
tell
gonna
you something
continue.
pops
Okay. So the last thing, I didn't mention this, but the last thing I do want to say is we are also considering, what does it mean to have Jews in America? What's the history of Jews in America, and what is the history of American Judaism, right? Which obviously very interpenetrated,
But also two different things.
and also two different things, right? It can be both of those things, right? And I think that that's really important because sort of there's like a classic like sort of activity that a lot of people split, like Cosmo quiz style. Are you an American Jew or a Jewish American, right? And ultimately, I don't think it's ever one or the other, but thinking about sort of what pieces come in, especially in a Reconstructionist context, of living in two cultures, is important. A Jew who lives in America, question mark, what? Can you say more, Joey? I'm sorry.
It just struck me that there isn't
I think there's
quite,
also like a certain point where, and we can't know where it was, but I'm sure we were much more insulated when we were smaller communities. And then as populations grew and we started to have neighborhoods and things like that, then we started to like leak the culture out and kind of be more.
Yeah, and also technology has, I mean, you cannot talk about being an American Jew or a Jew in America now without discussing the fact that we can have a community here that spans the entire country.
Yes.
We are currently in this room having a community that spans the country in a way that we could not have 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So there's an expansion of what it means to be a Jew in America and an American Jew now that we're not going to be able to go back to a time when people know what and I mean just stupid little things like, what is a Jap? It's a Jewish American princess. Where do Japs live? Jersey. Like, and that cultural like
Stamp
of the 1980s cultural communities is not the same thing as like, and there was a disparity between what a Jewish teenage girl in New Jersey was like and what a Jewish teenage girl in California was like, because that was Valley Girl.
and just different cultures, but now
Totally different cultures.
internet wise,
Now-
we found each other. The little bit of this group can find a little bit of this group and this group, and we
And
can all
now,
do this.
a Jewish
for
teen is a
example.
Jewish teen in a
Yeah.
lot of ways that,
Some things are getting standardized across the country.
yeah, I think there's a shift.
Mhm.
And it's becoming even more homogenized,
Mhm.
but that can be a good thing and a
Yeah.
bad thing. So,
Yeah.
but that's that global,
Mhm.
and 20 years ago, I would tell you that I wouldn't dare tell a Jew in a different country what to do because
That's a different
it's a
world.
totally different cultural community. Now that cultural community is shifting a
Yeah.
little bit. I don't think it's fully there. We're not a global community
No,
yet.
yeah, but
But
we're
we're
moving
shifting towards it.
Yeah.
And that's the concept of where we're going that we are looking at in this Inscribed project is how is that shift towards a global community
going to affect
going to affect us? And that's a really big question.
us.
Are we gonna export the stupid from the United States? Are we gonna export
Import
the
some wisdom from elsewhere.
yeah, I mean, like, there's some of, anyway, I don't know what that means.
So
That's gonna be a question for
I want us to
future.
keep that I want us to keep those understandings, so that I think one of the things that's happening is, again, I really resonated with this particular time period that I'm talking about, because I think a lot of things you're saying are strangely resonant for what's actually going on during the 19th century. So with that, now I'm going to actually talk about history. So
Damn it.
Go for it.
okay, so setting the wheels in motion. So in order to talk about America, we have to talk about not America. So in Spain, at this point, before the 14th century, Muslim kingdoms are in charge of Spain. And this is in many ways considered the golden era of Judaism. Particularly Sephardic Judaism, you have lots of art coming out, lots of unbelievable poets, and in the 14th century, Christians begin to push against Muslim kingdoms with La Reconquista, literally the reconquest. And they start actually taking cities, right? So they start conquering cities. So they take Castile, which is one of the first, and that leads to some pushback. Then they take places like Valencia and Seville and so on and so forth. And with the Reconquista, you also have the echoes of the massacres that are happening in the rest of Europe, and the Crusades in 1096. And you have a lot of conversion or death, right? These are the choices. And surprisingly, a lot of people chose to convert, or maybe not surprisingly. Certainly, more in Moorish, and well, not Moorish Spain at this point anymore, but in Spain during this time period, certainly more of them are converting than in the Ashkenazim, right? The Ashkenazim, for the most part, we have examples from Speyer and Mainz and Worms of group suicide, right? So there's sort of a distinction there of the Sephardi Jews are like, well, we want to live, right? And you have this piety that's going on in Ashkenaz that's very much die, martyr, right? Like I'll martyr before I become a Christian, which is, it's obviously a very different thing. And it says a lot about why maybe Sephardic Jews become so important to the development of American Judaism. And so this group of Jews is referred to by a lot of different names, usually often new Christians. Sometimes they're called Moranos, which is a very derogatory word, because Morano is a type of pig. Morano pigs.
Conversos?
And then, I'm sorry.
Conversos?
So conversos is another name, and Jews who remain Jewish, who choose not to convert, refer to them as anusim, the forced ones. So this is all going on in the 1300s. Eventually, the Christian kingdoms take Granada, and that's really sort of the nail in the coffin, so to speak. And that's the end of the Muslim rule of Spain. And so with that new Christian majority and hegemony, eventually in 1478, we get the institution of the Inquisition. So the Inquisition at this point, right, is in Spain, and Jews who are eventually expelled from Spain, right? It's either convert, die, or leave. Many choose to leave. Yeah.
Sorry,
no, you're right. And they begin to flee to Portugal, but eventually in Portugal, it also becomes illegal to be Jewish there in 1497 through the Inquisition, and so they once again have to flee. So eventually so with the new Christians, I do just want to say that early on, the new Christians are actually accepted as Christians, right? And they gain all of the rights of Christians, of Christian people who are already Christian. And so that does lead to a little bit more ease of travel, ease of moving other places. And at the same time, right, many of these Jews, especially the conversos, are beginning this idea or starting this idea of crypto Jew, right? The hidden Jewish practice or ritual. in early generations, they still spoke Hebrew, right? Because they were new converts, so they still spoke Hebrew. Eventually, that starts to peter out for obvious reasons, but that's what's going on. And eventually, they make their way to New Spain, which is in southern United States, Mexico, that into South America. But eventually, the Inquisition extends even to the New World, and that creates more problems. But you still have conversos who are immigrating to specifically South America and Mexico. And that's just a picture of Pope Innocent III. So one of the things that's going on, like in terms of restrictions, is Pope Innocent III was one of the people who created the law around badges, about Jews wearing badges, right? So being able to clearly identify is important. And I also want to say that there is at this point, Pope Innocent is really the height of the papacy around this time. So he's in the 1216-ish. But during this period of time, Catholicism is very much in power. The church is very powerful. And so you have this sort of fight between the monarchy and the church, right? So the monarchy, Jews have a very important economic function for many of these countries. They're money lenders in some cases. They build community, they're merchants, right? So the economy needs them. Unfortunately, many of the people who are in debt to Jewish people are the nobility, for obvious reasons. And so one of the things that's also going on with these expulsions is political pressure, because the easiest way to get rid of your debts is to expel your debtor, right? So this is what's going on. And in some cases, Jews are invited back to rebuild these communities, which is fascinating. But the monarchy, in many ways, tries to intervene, but the church is very powerful. And so we do have examples of violence against Jews in Spain during this time, such as in Toledo. So that's sort of what's going on. So eventually, some remained or converted, others began to move to the Netherlands, particularly to Amsterdam. And at some point, the Dutch invade Brazil because the Portuguese own or have colonized this area. And so the Dutch invade in 1624 and again in 1630. And between them, it's sort of seesawing between the Portuguese and the Dutch. And so it's sort of like we're free, right? So for example, in 1645, the Dutch give essentially full rights, Dutch citizenship in the New World to Jews. And Jews are located in Recife and on the eastern coast of Brazil. And things are going fine. Eventually, the Portuguese once again take it, and they are forced to once again flee. Are we sensing a pattern here? And so, again, many went back to Amsterdam. Some of them went to the Caribbean, which was a Dutch colony at that point. But 23 of them ended up by accident in New Amsterdam. And so while they weren't the first Jews in the New World or in the colonies, in fact, in 1492, one of the people on board Columbus's ship was a converso. And I do just want to point out here and stress that one of the things that's really interesting about early identity, specifically with the conversos, is actually very similar to doing work on queer people before the invention of the word queer or homosexual, right? So we're calling people queer, and it's actually anachronistic, right? Because maybe they weren't, but we recognize things in them that would say. So one of the first people to step into the New Land in 1492 was a converso. Was that a converso who was secretly practicing Judaism? I don't know. I'd love to find out. Maybe that exists. Or was this a person who genuinely converted and meant it, right? And so it's strange to kind of claim conversos as part of Jewish American history, but it's a queer moment of saying, are they, aren't they? So what actually ended up happening, I'll show you in a second. So this is, on the left, you'll see a little medal. This is designed by Alex Jagan for the Jewish American Hall of Fame of a guy named Asser Levy. Asser Levy was one of the early Dutch settlers who came to the New World. And when they got there, the governor, Peter Stuyvesant, did not, or Petter, I don't know how to pronounce it in Dutch, but Peter, Mr. Stuyvesant, Stuyvesant, thank you, did not like the Jews at all, and tried very, very hard to get them expelled once again. Asser Levy was one of the people who fought against this. What's interesting is he was actually not a Sephardic Jew, he was actually Ashkenazi, which is interesting, but fought very hard for the rights of Jews in the colony, the Dutch colony. One of the examples is at some point it was decided that every man had to do guard duty, but Jews would not be allowed to do guard duty, and because they weren't allowed to, they had to pay a tax. And so Asser Levy says, hold up, no, just let me do the guarding.
Yeah.
And there are documents that actually indicate that eventually he did, right? But so this is sort of like the backward forward of what's going on there. So one of the things that also happens is that the Jews that are in Amsterdam actually intervene on behalf of the Jews in the New World. And so this is actually from a letter to the Dutch West India Company, which are obviously in charge of the Dutch colony at this point. And it says, "Your honor should consider that the honorable lords, the burgomasters of the city, and the honorable, high, illustrious, mighty lords, the States General, have in political matters always protected and considered the Jewish nation as upon the same footing as all the inhabitants and burghers. Also, it is conditioned in the Treaty of Perpetual Peace with the King of Spain, the Treaty of Munster in 1648, that the Jewish nation shall also enjoy the same liberty as all other inhabitants of these lands. Your honors should also please consider that many of the Jewish nation are principal shareholders in the West India Company. They have all striven their best for the company, and many of their nation have lost immense and great capital in its shares and obligations." And so this was actually in response that the governor, Peter, had actually written to the West India Company to say, get them out of here. And the Jews in the colony wrote to their compatriots in Amsterdam who wrote this letter. And I think it's so funny to think that they're like, just slide right in there, right? There's a lot of, this.
Have you met my friends?
Yes, exactly. It's very like, the letter in whole is very like, well, we've done so much, like you're such so beneficent, blah, 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 blah. And also, I own 51% of this company, right? It's a very mommy dearest kind of moment, right? This ain't my first time at the rodeo.
And by the way, we own you.
And it's fascinating to think, right? So they're trying to both, which is interesting because on the one hand, it's proving both when we're talking about citizenship, right? It's proving sort of a patriotism, which is very important and obviously comes into play with early America. And it also is talking about investment and the role that economic power wields, which nobody is surprised by this, perhaps, but it's certainly a recognition of how that is power that the Jews can yield in this way, speaking to a state, which is pretty fascinating. So this, just so we know, what happened with these 23 is, so on the bottom little thing is Recife in eastern Brazil. The red line is obviously where they were trying to go. They were trying to go back to Amsterdam. There was a large storm and they actually had to take cover in Jamaica. And then eventually they ended up in New Amsterdam. So were it not for a storm, a chance storm, this all might have happened much later or in a very different way, which I think is really, this is one of those things, you can't, some things you can, some things you can't plan, right? This wasn't something they could plan. So colonial America. So in 1664, the British take New Amsterdam and they rename it New York. Jews are tolerated, but they're not allowed to practice in public or rent spaces until 1595, when I believe it was the Duke of York eventually grants them the ability to rent. So in 1695, they established the first congregation. Or they gain a space in 1695 that they rent. It's not a synagogue, and we'll talk about that, why this is confusing in a second. Established the first congregation in the 1730s. So the oldest, and this took me a long time to sort of work out. So the oldest synagogue is,
True.
yes, the oldest actual building built for a synagogue, right? But they are not the first congregation. And so that's an important difference. So the first congregation is actually Shearith Israel in New York. And eventually they'll be able to rent and eventually build their own. This is followed by communities in Savannah and Charleston, Philadelphia, and which is considered one of the first Ashkenazi synagogues, and of course Newport. On the right-hand side, you can see this is 1879. This is the building that Congregation Shearith Israel is still in, and it's actually
They're still in the same building?
Yes.
Wow.
So this is this is their fifth place, and what's actually really interesting is that the building for Congregation Shearith Israel looks very much like Rodef Shalom in Pittsburgh, in terms of its structure, which is fascinating. One of the things I also wanted to talk about in terms of this economic piece, right? So obviously Jews are, if Jews have money, if they have the ability to buy things, right? That means, that raises the stakes a little bit. And so one of the first thing that the Jews create in the United States, do you know? The first thing that they buy and make? It's land, I'll give you that. Cemetery.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So you're not allowed to practice religion in public, right? But you have to bury your dead.
Yeah,
Right.
somewhere.
And you're almost certainly not going to be allowed to be buried in a Christian graveyard, right? So this creates a real logistical and town planning kind of problem. So they are allowed to build a cemetery, but they're not allowed to build a synagogue, which is what it is.
Okay.
And so
We'll let you die.
exactly,
That's it.
it's very hazy. And one of the things that's really interesting is, so in 1672, there's a legal case of this Jewish-owned merchant ship called the Trial. And it gets seized in Jamaica, and they're told that it's confiscated. You can't have it, essentially, because you're not Christians. And remember at this point that Jews in England do not have citizenship. However, this actually gets adjudicated, and it says that anybody who has business or legal standing in New York follows that law. So it's by proxy the first time that Jews are gaining some sense of the rights of citizenship from the British, which is really interesting. It makes it very complicated of well, you let us do this, so how else does that work? At this point, Jews are beginning to spread to other colonies, some more welcoming than others. So Rhode Island, because we eventually get the Newport Synagogue, right? We understand that Rhode Island is a place where there's that's built on religious freedom. And so Rhode Island is very welcoming. Massachusetts, on the other hand, not so much. They do not like you in Massachusetts. That good Puritan spirit is still very much there. You're welcome if you're Christian. If not, maybe not so much. Also, go ahead. What?
Not Catholic.
But not Catholic, yeah. No, to the
Not too
Catholics.
Christian.
Yeah, not too Christian. What's interesting is at this point, Rhode Island College, which later becomes Brown University, also allows admissions for Jews in 1770s, which is
Earlier than others?
definitely
That's
early.
the first?
Definitely,
Yeah.
I believe it is the first, yeah. And in terms of creating sort of an ethos of welcome, right? Certainly that very much shifts the culture. You look like you have a question.
No, I was just trying to think of when assorted colleges were founded, because I think Rutgers was 1772 where I had gone. So it's this, they were, I don't know how old the Rhode Island College was at the point, but
I don't know,
it's
unfortunately.
it's early.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's earlier than I expected.
Yeah, because I mean, if you look at the quote unquote Ivies,
Yeah.
it's
Brown, Harvard, yeah.
Brown, Harvard, Yale, Rutgers, Delaware, Dartmouth.
I don't think Rutgers counts as Ivy,
No.
but anyway.
They're close. In terms of years of
Yeah, age,
existence.
yeah, age, yes.
Like, because University of Delaware counts as an Ivy but isn't an Ivy,
Yeah,
because it's also age of,
it's a hang around.
yeah.
Yeah, so this is, and eventually, right, you'll, I believe it's at Harvard. Believe it's Harvard, right? Eventually it becomes a requirement to take Hebrew, which is fascinating. But the faculty had to be Christian, and so somebody actually converted in order to teach there, which is very, so it's not all rosy, but very interesting
That's
stuff.
fun.
So
Yeah, most of the founding fathers
Stroke.
New Hebrew, yeah,
Because they had to take
absolutely.
Hebrew.
yeah, right.
Yeah,
Because they went to Harvard and Yale and they all had to take Hebrew.
side note, this is not in this presentation at all, but something I was very interested in. I actually worked with a professor at University of Vermont who worked on early America, and she was doing a project at some point in America. People thought that the indigenous people were the lost tribes. And so they were trying to do comparative work between Hebrew and indigenous languages
Wow.
to try and make connections between them. Not my professor, but
Yeah.
people during early America, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
It's a funny thing. So that sort of colonial setting, colonial practice was interesting, right? So obviously, this is not different today. Difficulty of many observances in rural places, right? So if you don't have access to things, it's going to be more difficult to do things. More urban places can identify a communal shochet, so they can do kashrut, or at times they would have kosher meat shipped to them. There's indications of things being stamped with that. There are no ordained clergy in the United States at this point, right? There may have been there may have been a rabbi that visited, right, or whatever. Maybe there, but at this point, there are no ordained clergy that are leading the way in American practice. So you have very literate, some very literate Jews. You have some very not literate Jews, right? Remember that the first 23, right, are Sephardic, but conversos, right, new Christians, right? So that piece of what's lost and what's kept is very interesting, right? So especially in New Spain and in Mexico, at some point, they were trying to use words that they understood, that they remembered. So it would be like Adonai and Shema, but the rest would be in Spanish, right, or Portuguese, right? They were using Christian formats. They were using Christian prayers and adapting them. In order to hide their practices, they would celebrate the feast of Saint Esther. Saint Esther doesn't exist, right? And so they would have pork at home so that they could give people pork while they didn't eat pork to, so you have all of this stuff going on, but you have practices that are being filtered through. You have people coming who are more literate or right in certain ways, but you don't have ordained clergy. You also obviously have a greater adaptation to the bigger non-Jewish community. If you're a merchant and people are trading on Saturday, you're probably also going to trade on Saturday, right? Because that's just the the reality of it. But also interestingly is at this point you already have intermarriage happening. And so at this point, what's interesting is almost as bad as Jewish, non-Jewish, just Sephardic and Ashkenazi marriage matches.
Hey.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. So this on the left-hand side is a woman named Bila Abigail Levy Franks, 1730s. She's writing two of her children married Christians, one of them in New York and the other one from a woman from Philadelphia. And so you have sort of an anxiety about it, and also the reality that many people are doing this. Some conversos came to the United States and remained Christian, right? It wasn't, some people were using it as a cover, some people legitimately were doing that. And so this is a concern at this point. By the 1720s, Sephardic custom continues to dominate, although Ashkenazi Jews are starting to make up a majority. So yes.
That's when the first wave comes over, late 17s or early 18s was the real Ashkenazim wave.
So 18s. 18s.
Gotcha.
I'm probably going to turn the slide and be wrong, but let's see what happens.
I won't know the difference.
So
I can.
then we get to the American Revolution. As we may imagine, like the American Civil War, the Revolution split many people along loyalist and patriot lines. Sometimes brothers, right? But we have some important figures. Chaim Solomon, who's buried in Philadelphia, who was a financier for the war. He eventually died penniless. So
He was
didn't
also
really...
the first national bank president. He the first bank of the United States. He was the one in charge. Washington made him in charge of the first national bank.
So there you go. Yes, one way or another, very important. I did not know about the president thing, but that's very interesting.
He was
So
good
it
friends,
makes me wonder.
friends with Washington. He was good
We're
friends.
good friends with Washington, but it makes me wonder about the continuing legacy of money lending, which is, who can never quite get away from it. We also have Francis Salvador. He was the first Jewish elected official in 1775 in South Carolina. Imagine we can't get a Jew elected today, but that's okay. Francis Salvador was actually also the first Jew to die in the American Revolution. He was fighting a group of indigenous people and was scalped and killed. And then Gershom Mendes Saxes, who was a clergy person, again, not a rabbi, but super influential in deciding what Jewish practice looked like in a religious sense. So by the end of the 18th century, there are about 3,000 Jews in the United States, and more than half of them are actually living in the South. So thinking about our experience today, that's, again, really fascinating because we have certainly a very North-centric understanding of Jewish stereotypes, right? Bagels, locks, big, loud, brassy voices, lots of Torah, right? And what we're seeing here is actually that wasn't really the case, especially because, and I mean, I'm spinning out a little bit. I can't back this up, but I do wonder about the influence of things like Puritanism and certain strains of Protestant understanding, even as we know that by the end of the 19th century, you have Jews who are deliberately mimicking Christian practice in a lot of ways. So it's Protestant practice. So it's actually it's a strange ambiguity. And so 19th century, we have we have a federal understanding of Jews as citizens. And in some states, we have an understanding of Jews as citizens, but there's a lot of pushback. There's still rules about who can be elected, what they can be in charge of, that sort of thing. So you have a fight back and forth about that. One of the things that I think that I'm really interested in, and was a misunderstanding that I actually had for a long time, is that Reform Judaism in general, we often talk about Reform Judaism comes out of Germany. We have the Haskalah in the 1700s, which is, our version of the Enlightenment. And you have these Jews who are saying, well, we can do it differently, like Einhorn and David Einhorn, who was a rabbi. But what's interesting is reform is actually coming from both outside and happening naturally within the United States. So in 1824, you actually have an example of a synagogue in Charleston that's asking for the services to be shorter and in English. Sound familiar?
1824.
No.
They're the Reconstructionists of that time.
So this is the thing, right? What gets called reform does have a very Reconstructionist bent to it. We don't want to get rid of it. It's just not meaningful to us, right? Thinking about Jewish literacy, right? It's actually not surprising that you would want people to talk in the vernacular. And we see that again and again with things like literature, right? We have Chaucer and we have Shakespeare who are writing in the vernacular as opposed to, or Dante even, who creates a totally new vernacular with the Inferno and Purgatorio and right, so you have this push from within. It gets declined. They leave and then come back, right? But you have these people who are saying, well, I'm going to make a halakha, I'm going to make a Jewish practice that fits with the life that I lead, right? And the realities of what is around me. Also, you have a pushback of the Ashkenazim against Sephardi practice because they're saying it's not ours, right? Like we're doing it because you have the oldest synagogues, right? But that's pushing people to sort of define their own. You also have an influx of German, right, immigrants, right, who come with their own practice.
And they become like a critical mass large enough to have their own congregations.
Indeed,
and their own
right? And so they're moving, right? And so some major figures of the period, Isaac Leeser, Rebecca Gratz, Henrietta Zold. So Henrietta Zold is the one who starts Hadassah.
We have a class on Henrietta Zold on the YouTube channel, just saying.
Check it out. It's going to be much better at explaining that than me.
And Bershom Mendes Sexus.
Yes.
Sexus, I don't know how to pronounce it.
Sexiest.
Check out the YouTube.
Sexiest. No, I don't know. We're all guessing. And then any last name that has an X, I'm here for it. Isaac Leeser, not a rabbi again, but one of the major powers, prolific in terms of translation. Leeser's translation of the Bible is one of the most important for sort of kicking that off and starting it. He's the one who starts preaching in English. Very influential in that way. And Rebecca Gratz, who many of us probably have heard of multiple times, but Rebecca Gratz is instrumental in starting so many public aid things. One of the things that's interesting is that in the United States, many times the government would say, you can stay, you have to support yourself. And so on the one hand, taking care of each other as a community is a very Jewish value. It's also built into our understanding of what it means to be successful in America. You take care of your own. And so Rebecca Gratz starts an orphan asylum, starts a Jewish Women's Auxiliary that raises money and funds. She's the first person to create a Sunday school, right? She's a badass, right? She does a lot of stuff.
Gratz College?
Gratz College is, yeah. So, and I mean, the Gratz family is in general a powerful family. And Rebecca Gratz really just lives up to why that family is so important and influential. So this is all happening during the 1840. In 1840, the very first ordained rabbi at a congregation comes to America. His name is Abraham Rice.
So obviously, it wasn't ordained here because there's no schools here yet. This is import.
Yes,
Okay,
imported. And for many years, it's going to be imports. But Abraham Rice, at first it was R-E-I-S-S. I don't know why they changed it to, but
Ellis Island.
yes.
Well, it doesn't exist.
But Abraham Rice is the first one. Has a lot of pushback from his community because he is a German rabbi, right? And he doesn't understand what's going on. Eventually, Abraham Rice leaves the pulpit and opens a store, which is fascinating. Yeah, by 1880, there's an estimated 250,000 Jews in the United States. So imagining from 3,000, right,
200.
to 250,000, that's a huge jump. And so that's creating, like you were saying before, Liz, more, like even greater diversity of practice, diversity of language, diversity of, right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Also in the 1800s, we have sort of a push of establishing reform as a thing in the United States. So immigrants who are coming to the United States are bringing reform ideas. It's still not quite their practice in the United States, but they're bringing those ideas with them. And so Isaac Mayer Wise, rabbi, German, is prolific, right? Goes on to create the United Association of Hebrew Congregations in 1873, the Central Conference of American Rabbis in 1889, and founds HUC, the Hebrew Union College, right? So finally, we have a real place where American rabbis can be ordained, trained in America, and because he notices this problem of the Americans, the German Jewish rabbis are not successful here because they're not American. We need people who are trained, who know the language intimately, who have different skills. Along with this, go ahead.
It's living in this civilization too.
Right, 100%. In 1885, we have the Pittsburgh Platform. The Pittsburgh Platform would go on to have many instantiations, but the Pittsburgh Platform really defines principles. So at this point, lots of people are trying to figure out what are our principles. We have pushback from more orthodox-leaning places, right? For example, this is around the time that the first synagogue puts in an organ, right? Weiss is one of the first people, or is one of the people who institutes mixed seating, right? So you have all of these huge upheavals that are happening in the US. Many of these things are also happening in Germany. And so you have that interplay between the two. Just as a side note, one of the things that's really interesting about David Einhorn is at one point he suggested that the holy language of the Jews should be German, which is fascinating. And that just was too much for some people. And so that actually ended up not happening. But
So then he was excommunicated.
Right, but the influence of Germany in terms of the clergy they're providing, the ideas that they're giving can't be underestimated. And this is a truly American innovation, right? In terms of even their practices are not necessarily perfectly aligned with what it means to be a German reformer. So 1885 Pittsburgh Platform is the one that defines things like they get rid of kashrut. They get rid of, to a certain extent, they get rid of chosenness.
That's very
Not quite, they're not to the level that Kaplan does, obviously, but they're playing with this idea of what does it mean. Specifically, their wording has to do with a people versus a religion. So they believe that Judaism is a religion, but people creates real problems for them, right? If there are people, then there's racial distinction as well. And so I'm putting this out here, but I don't want to say that this is one of the things that sort of institutes one of the examples of whiteness, right? But it is certainly a taking on of privilege to be able to say, we are not that. Right, which is very interesting. So I don't know as much to say more about it, or to even know if it's entirely true, but it is an interesting idea of how does the story of whiteness play into the development of these communities. Yes, so I'll leave it at that. So I'm actually going to end with 1886. So because the last thing I want to say is what's fascinating is the we often like to think of sort of a neat progression from Orthodoxy to liberal Judaism, and it's anything but that, right? It's constantly branching and moving backwards and forwards. So we have Judaism at one point, right? It's just Judaism. There's no Orthodox Judaism. This is just Judaism. Reform Judaism is really the precursor to, right? It's the major corrective, right, in some ways. And then you have a pushback against reform,
Yeah.
which leads to the founding of JTS in 1886 by Sephardic Jews.
Okay.
And this is sort of when we begin to understand, and eventually JTS will not be enough for some, right? And modern orthodoxy will be defined in new ways, and that spectrum really develops, right?
And it's as we hit that critical mass of the population that you can find enough people that think like you, that now you can split off and do this. And
Absolutely.
as the waves came through, it just keeps mixing the balance of old world, new world, and the levels of orthodoxy. And
Well, I mean, but we also have to remember that right up until this point, many Ashkenazi Jews are members in Sephardic communities, right? Even though it's not their minhag, it's not their
it's because it's what's
practice,
there.
because it's what's there. So yes, finding like-minded people is wonderful, but it's also a matter of saying, well, you are Jewish, so we could say Kaddish, right? Like, you know what I mean? So you count enough. And so this is all really in response in many ways to this idea that Judaism in America is on the brink of, right, especially when it was at the 3,000 mark in between, is on the brink of disappearing, right? Conversion, intermarriage is so high. And so this is, the intermarriage scare, the interfaith scare, right, is very much present. And so in some ways, making Judaism literate Jews and Jews that understand and appreciate their culture, right, is a way of combating that, right? If you make places where people like to go and identify and feel in community, then they won't leave community, right? And so it makes sense that there's a lot of that work being done on what does it mean to be a Jew socially as well as does it mean religiously. And by way of...
Which gets down to shul with a pool, JCC.
Shul with a pool, JCC, absolutely. And so I want to... it's sort of incongruous, right? It's founded, that's all that matters. But I do want to say, just because it's my favorite piece of history, so this is the Treifa banquet, and so this is in 1883. Jane, I know you love entertaining, and so I wanted to put it out there. So in some ways, the Treifa banquet is identified as one of the sort of camel, right, straw that broke the camel's back. It was, the menu was little neck clams, half shell, consommé royale, sauterne, feuille de boeuf, a champignon, soft shell crab, salad of shrimp, sweetbreads, chicken, asparagus sauce, vinaigrette, right? These are ice cream, all followed by ice cream, right? It is the biggest middle finger that you can give to kashrut in some ways, and the chutzpah, right, to do this and serve this and understand, what's going on here. Many people have said that it was by accident. Some people have said it's by accident. Some people said it was very intentional. And either way, it was enough to create a significant rift and one that would eventually lead to the founding of other colleges and other, right, or be part of that lineage. And so I end here because I think in many ways this story plays out with us today. I think the question of Jews on the brink of disappearing continues to be a narrative that we hear and sometimes unintentionally bring out in different ways, maybe not along the lines of intermarriage, but in the ideas of, oh, woe is I, nobody understands anything anymore, right? Oh, woe is I, kids these days, woe is that, right? So
My kids don't come to synagogue with me.
And so,
but they identify specifically as very Jewish. Like if you ask them what their background is, what their religion is, I'm Jewish, but I don't practice. Or
Same with your
But it's what gets down to how much practice do you need to be a Jew?
0.
you can just,
It's like how
because
much
even if
practice
like I was raised
how
with
much-
no practice, but yet the influence on my childhood and the tradition, like it's, trust me, there's a pattern.
Oh, yeah.
Are,
You know,
are the
so-
speakers working?
And how much do you need to believe in one aspect of Judaism in order to consider yourself Jewish?
Yeah.
Well,
What is Jewish enough is a question that
testing.
other people ask me.
Mm-hmm.
My aunt asks me all the time, you know, am I considered Jewish enough?
Mhm.
And I'm like, it all depends on who you ask.
Mhm.
Is Joey Jewish enough now?
Mm.
Or does Joey have to convert, have to do the next step? As far as we're concerned, Joey's Jewish enough. My aunt is Jewish enough because they want to be Jewish. But
You're Jewish if somebody says you are.
you're Jewish if somebody are you Jewish if somebody says you are, or are you Jewish if you say you are?
Are you Jewish until someone hates you?
Yeah, I mean, like, cause the answer is that I'm not Jewish enough by a lot of people's standards. I have not been to a mikveh. I have not done a conversion. My mother was not converted until after I was born.
Yeah.
So, by some people's standards, I'm not Jewish.
Yeah.
By an Orthodox standard, I'm not Jewish because my mother's not
I
Jewish.
sat in that chair and had someone sitting in that chair tell me, no, you're not Jewish because X, Y, Z.
Yes.
Jess had something to add. So unmute if you want, Jess, you should be able to.
I've been unmuted. Can you hear me?
And Joey wrote, I was thinking earlier, a Jew who lives in America, going further from what Rachel was saying, what about people who live in the United States, as some want to avoid saying American, when the US is only one part of American?
Yeah.
Hello?
Jess, no, I can't. I don't
You hear me now?
wait, do my power, I may have pulled my speaker out. Of power source. No, I didn't.
Okay, well then unplug it and. No, unplug it and put your.
Yeah, just that on. Okay, try again, Jess.
Testing?
Got- Clear.
Okay,
Sorry.
no problem. I actually tried to jump in a few times earlier and wasn't sure if everything was muted or what was going on.
Sorry, I had an
dead
extra speaker and that's not working.
As far as Jews are disappearing, I am extremely disturbed by that ever since I met someone who used that as justification for push for not just allowing conversion but active proselytizing and seeking converts, and that just
Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
That's but I can't help the extreme switch between what we're saying right now and what they said at that meeting in, was it Philadelphia, where they said where they defined Judaism as a religion.
Pittsburgh, yeah.
Their platform.
The Pittsburgh platform, which it does sound very much to me, especially given the timeline, as an attempt to refute any attempt to place Judaism in a non-white context in America. But that 150 years ago, Jews in America were completely rejecting the idea that Judaism was any more than a religion. And now we're all sitting here going, of course it's not just a religion, of course Judaism is an ethnicity and identity. And I'm wondering how much a role the Great Pogrom and the Shoah played in that.
And us grasping at whiteness when we could.
No,
Different.
in us flipping away from grasping at whiteness to grasping at, no, it's not just a religion.
Yeah. Yeah. That's Kaplan?
Because
I mean, it's a definitely. I mean, especially in Reconstructionist, I'd like to do some more research on it myself. But thinking about Judaism,
Our next class.
yeah, right,
Next class.
right. So Kaplan talking about evolving religious civilization. So
Mm-hmm.
Kaplan has some skin in the game in saying that it's a religious community and that it's not defined by blood in that way, ethnically in that way, even as he does make passing reference to ethnicity. He doesn't define it as race, he does define it as ethnicity. He sort of uses that at different times. I'd like to massage that out a little bit more because I think he's kind of I feel like he's kind of imprecise with it. And I think that he's also not really dealing with the question of what it means for people for whom it's not an ethnicity that they can feel, that they can claim comfortably for lots of different reasons. So I think that's really interesting. And I mean, to be fair, right, we can go all the way biblical and talk about the very different ways by which Jews are defined as Jews, right? We know it can't, but it may not be blood. Ishmael's not Jewish, but Isaac is, right? We know that you can become part of it just by saying you're Jewish because of Ruth, but we also know in Ezra and Nehemiah that they get pushed out and they say, no, if you're not Jewish, you can't marry them. Even though Moses was married to a Cushite woman, right? It is a stunning collage of what is going on, right? Both in our stories as well as our verifiable history. So I think that's really interesting, Jess. I would love to have a bigger conversation about it.
I also, going back a bit further, I just, we're the early on about the conversos and the Sephardic and Ashkenazic and all, I couldn't help thinking, we treat the question of who is a Jew today as if it is a problem that was created by the split between Reform and Conservative and Orthodox. But they had the exact same problem then. It was framed in different terms. Is a converso a Jew? Is my Ashkenazic neighbor a Jew when I'm Sephardic, and do they count as a Jew given their different background and tradition? This person who came from Europe who claims that they're a Jew who just showed up, how do I know?
And at a certain point they had to get along together because otherwise you maybe couldn't make a minyan unless you brought both sides in. But then again, we got the critical mass of people like us and got to divide and split and compartmentalize.
But I mean, your converso neighbor who attends synagogue with you but keeps pork in their house.
Well, but that would be a problem. So generally speaking, the rabbis were actually wrote halakha that said conversos still have a place in the Jewish community, like they're still Jewish, right? So if you're going to synagogue, even if you were a converso, according to the rabbis, you're Jewish, right?
That's kind of
Again, it becomes you're Jewish if you say you are.
And Joey's saying, and that included ideas of who counts towards a minyan, and we've counted Honey and Boogie, which are 2 dogs, and counts in the past.
But I guess what centers for me is that just like the Judaism is disappearing, we act like who is a Jew is a modern question.
Yeah.
And but these are things, in a way, I would almost say that asking who is a Jew is part of the history of the Jewish people.
Yes.
The more I learn the history, the more I see these questions as being much more common than modern, and they're, instead of being a sign that Judaism is dissolving and disappearing and weakening, it's, oh, we're here again.
It's a sign of our resilience.
Yes.
Because we redefine what is a Jew based on the circumstances that we see too. So what is a Jew can be different in each country that we reside in can be different and also can be similar, because there's similarities in
I
all of
think-
them.
I think Alex, you said about Kaplan being not consistent, I guess is the best way to put it, in how he referred to Judaism as a religion or an ethnicity and how he handled that. And I've always thought that English does not have a good word for peoplehood.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, he uses peoplehood frequently.
Yeah. He kind of changed the definition in a way to make it, it's not a perfect fit, but
Gosh.
I see what you mean, like.
I don't know if you can hear Darius in the background. He's going, what is peoplehood? What in the world is that? And yes, translating Yehudot, you can say peoplehood, but some people won't get that. And you can say ethnicity and that doesn't fit. And race absolutely doesn't fit. And religion is kind of, well, religion is part of it. But
Yeah.
Yeah, there's nothing all encompassing, it's just.
and peoplehood requires evolving and adapting while still maintaining coherence.
Yeah.
And that requires constantly questioning who is a Jew, constantly, oh my God, we're dissolving, we're disappearing, the old ways. Of course, the old ways are changing and disappearing. If they, you need to change to live.
Look at the big pivot. Bye-bye temple. What do we do now?
Right.
How do you be Jewish? Completely changed. How do you be? How do you do? Definitions and so we're constantly hitting these periods of, okay, now what?
And I really like seeing that in this history because it's so often glossed over, I think.
Yeah, you're right. I do think of it as a monarch question, but it's not. No, it's a Jew.
And if you go back, who is a Jew was totally different to the people who were the Ascetics who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Essenes.
Essenes. Their definition of what is a Jew didn't fit the rest of the world, and they were still struggling with that question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we also have the very interesting example of, and the only still existing Jewish alternative, which is the Karaites, right?
Mhm.
So the Karaites, right, who have interpreted Jewish law vastly differently, were never not considered Jewish, right?
Just a different kind.
Just a different kind of Jew, right? Not different like we would see like Samaritans or something like that, right? Or many people would mistake Messianic Jews as being part of Jews, right? But Karaite is a really fascinating piece of history of like, what do you do with denominational, like true denominationalism?
Yeah.
In the sense that right, you get some of that with Reform, Reconstruction, right? Like you certainly get people who believe different things, but yeah, it's a very interesting thing. We have a lot more. I think there's certainly a very different tolerance for ambiguity, which is what I was talking about yesterday. Right, there's a different tolerance for ambiguity in Jewish culture and religious thought, almost than we have now. Right, even as we know more, we become more skeptical and less. It's very interesting, right? People tend toward the spectrum, toward the poles of skepticism and fundamentalism, right? As you're confronted with more information, either you have to say, well, then it's all meaningless, or you say, that's wrong, and what I thought originally was correct, right? And so figuring out that middle zone is really, it's not an easy
That's life right
thing.
here.
And so, and like, this is why, right, this question of, I agree, Jess, right? Like who is a Jew is certainly not a modern question, right? But
you've still got the Treifa banquet up on the screen share, and I'm looking at this as we talk about it, and I can't help seeing this as a shove it in their face, this question.
Oh yeah, this is we're going out.
I know you said some people, I don't see how this could be an accident. I really don't.
Listen, I don't get that either, but I'm gonna actually stop the share if that's okay.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
of course. There you go.
One of the things that I think is really interesting, though, is I think we need to get better about talking about and considering that who is a Jew, more than just asking the question and thinking it solves what we're actually talking about. I do want to say that it's also considering what is the usefulness of this question. Like, why are we using this question? Because I don't, right? Like, I can see one side of it is fully a gatekeeping function, and right, if we have no definition at all, then we really lose one sense of the community. Now that's like a slippery slope. I think it would take a lot for that to become true.
No, the Messianic Jews are trying to do it to us right now.
Yeah, but I mean,
that's exactly what they're trying to pull. They're trying to destroy us by defining themselves as us.
I think that's how it started, for sure. But I'm not entirely sure. I meet Pentecostals and Messianic Jews at school who really feel strongly attached to the Jewish community in ways that I have struggled with, but they have bat mitzvahs and bar mitzvahs and feel the younger folks in that community feel a very strong tie to Judaism, and it is very tough for me to struggle with, and that is something that we don't necessarily like. Messianic Judaism brought my sister back to our family in a lot of ways.
I will rephrase then, Messianic Jewish organizations.
Absolutely. I will agree there. Yeah, the underlying fundamentalist pay structure for those organizations is definitely trying to do that. How it's implemented may not be the same for the people that it's implemented for.
And however, just because I like to play devil's advocate, because that's maybe my job, I don't know, I guess that's sort of my job, right?
You're the rabbi, it's your job.
On the other hand, we have to deal with the reality that it was not unheard of to believe in Jesus and be Jewish. That's where Christianity started, right? So we have very clear indicators. We do have a fight. So this is what's interesting about Messianic Judaism, is if you become a Messianic Jew, right? We have a fight between, I believe it's Paul. I believe they're fighting over whether people who weren't Jewish before needed to follow Jewish practice once they become Christians. And some people say yes, and some people say only if you grew up Jewish do you continue to follow the laws of Judaism and believe in Jesus, right? So
I got way too much background on this growing up. Peter wanted to keep it, you had to be Jewish, and Paul basically hijacked the whole thing and pivoted to make it specifically proselytizing to Gentiles and walking away from Jewish traditions.
So there you go. But I only bring that up to say, right, is that, like, again, in a different time period, the question was different. It wasn't to suggest that they didn't see these people as Jewish, even though we have a very complicated relationship with saying that you're Jewish and believe in Jesus, right? I don't, and to be clear, I'm not in disagreement with you, Jess, right? Like, I would also say, and most people who are in the community would say, if you're a Messianic Jew, you're not Jewish, right? So I'm not in disagreement, but I do think, again, what you're saying, this question is not modern, right?
Yeah.
And what other things are not modern, and how have they showed up across history, and what function did they serve? It's very, very interesting. Yeah.
Because if we didn't define ourselves, label ourselves, we're not visible in some way. So there's, again, the purpose of why did we define, why do we have to label and do that little.
Well, I think it's how we avoided dissolving and disappearing. We cannot exist if we are not distinct.
There has to be
It's
a
part
boundary.
of why I personally am anti-assimilationist, and I think we need the push-pull. We need the people who push for assimilation, and we need the people who push against it. But I personally fall on the against it side because I refuse to disappear.
And I refuse to disappear, but also I'm not anti-assimilationist, but I am anti-invisible. Because I wear my yarmulke on purpose because I think far too many Jews want to blend in to the point where they're not seen as Jewish, and we're not fighting hate by disappearing into the greater, and in America that becomes whiteness. Because by disappearing into whiteness, we are allowing the narrative that we're just another white person who doesn't understand.
It goes beyond, sorry. But by doing that, we're also abandoning our own. The only reason, because some of us can disappear into whiteness.
Yes, but not all of us can.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like you can't see me as human if you don't see me.
Yeah.
So we have to keep going, here I am.
But that's sort of that same idea that an LGBT folk has to, a person in the LGBT community has to do is, do I have the spoons to out myself every time? Is it worth it to me? And we constantly have this conversation in the LGBT community of, no, you don't have to out yourself every time. If you need to blend in today because today you don't have the spoons for it, then yes, I have a great hat. My hat is cool.
Yeah.
Yes, it's pretty. But some days I enjoy wearing my yarmulke, yes. And I wear my yarmulke because I want to fight institutional hate.
Yeah.
But I don't always out myself.
It's being a good elder.
Yeah. And knowing when you have the spoons for an educable moment and when you have the spoon and don't have the spoons for it.
We're allowed to back away from the fight every time,
Right.
It's,
I wear my rainbows. No, I don't always, out myself as part of the LGBT community. Some people don't assume I'm a part of the LGBT community because I'm cis passing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's the same conversation that you have within multiple communities, and we need to see that. I was explaining to Mom this morning, I had a 50-year-old Black woman tell me that they didn't know what the ADL was. And it shook me. Because I'm like, oh my God, how can you be a PhD, have a doctorate in something and not know what the most important anti-bias organization in the United States has been for the last 50 years. And then I'm like, wait a minute, it's not a Black organization, so they wouldn't know. That's my bias, but also.
Yeah, your first thought is Anti-Defamation League.
Right, that's my first thought, but it's not for a lot of folks.
Yeah. I asked somebody yesterday, what do you think the worldwide population, the percentage of Jews is? Jess, do you know the number?
The worldwide population of what?
The world population of Jews, I believe it's like 0.2%. Something like that. Either way, the guy gets
13 million.
13 million. Okay. 40%. He gets 40%.
40.
Granted, this is someone who grew up in Brooklyn.
Wow.
Okay,
Uh,
I get that,
Asterisk.
but no,
Not so much.
no.
He was genuinely shocked.
And the funny thing is that part of the reason why I wear my yarmulke at school is because the only Jews that the kids at school know are the ones that live in New York and that are Orthodox.
Yeah.
And they don't realize that other
They're
Jews
here
exist.
too.
Like, they
Yeah.
don't understand that there's non-Orthodox
Yes,
Jews.
yes.
Yeah.
They don't understand
Uh-huh.
that there's a sect of there's other sects of Judaism. Just like they don't understand that there's sects of Christianity sometimes, so,
Yeah.
you know.
Jews, they're people too.
But it's amazing how much people don't know about their own communities, let alone
Yeah.
outside communities.
Mm-hmm.
Even to this day.
Yeah, that's true.
And we talk about globalization and then we talk about hiding from globalization because a lot of communities are hiding from globalization
Preserves the uniqueness and
or just from lack of education.
yeah.
Excuse me, I would like to suggest that, on a totally different note, that we probably have survived partially because we are also a community that has laws, and we are a legal society by which we act and preserve ourselves. And we fit into America well because it also chose to become a country, a place of laws that people have to follow. So I would suggest that the laws are never not interpretable. Sorry for the double negative. But we require a definition of what is a Jew because we are a nation of laws, and we must wrestle with that question. But we need to come up with there has to be some definition if we are to remain a people of laws.
Mhm.
And the laws get into this is what you do for a Jew, this is what you do for a non-Jew. This is it's that's in there somewhat.
But I also think that may be part of the ambiguity in America about who is a Jew, because historically, in many places in the old world, Jewish communities followed Jewish law as distinct from the Christian law or Muslim law of their neighbors. And so if you were a Jew, you lived under Jewish law as determined by the rabbis. And as long as you didn't piss off the Goyim, the Jewish communities were self-contained and did their own thing. There were exceptions. Amsterdam is a big one, as I understand it. But, you had the Ottoman Empire, you had their courts were divided by religion, that remains an issue in Israel today. That's where the whole marriage situation in Israel comes from. They inherited it from the Ottoman Empire.
Trying to remember the phrase. Yeah, I just want to be careful about the legal piece, right? So that's what it is. Dinam de Malchut Dina, right? The law of the kingdom or of the land is the law. So built into rabbinic Judaism is a deference to the experience of diaspora, the experience, or if you don't want to call it diaspora, the experience of living in a culture that is not majority Jewish, right? So yes, I think you're definitely right, Jess, in the sense that often legal power and legal autonomy was used as a bargaining chip, right? Of saying, yes, you're in charge of these things, right? But you also have examples. So, for example, in Spain with Alfonso X, he wrote Las Siete Partidas, which are the 7 parts of law, and one of those parts deals with Jews. And so anything, right? So one of them, which goes along with you, is what you're saying is if there's a Christian party, it is not under Jewish law, right? And there's pieces of like, so I don't want to undermine places where Jews are in charge and under their own laws, but in reality, that was not, you know.
Yeah, always subordinate. I just like the ghettos in Europe. Within the ghetto, Jewish law held, and everyone who lived in the ghetto was under Jewish law, unless Christians got involved. And that rule was set down by the Christian rulers. It was the Christian rulers who divided us.
Well, Jews, but what's interesting is there's examples Jews could go above, could go beyond their Beit Din, right? So there are examples of Jews actually appealing to civil authorities in order to get out of judgment by Jewish law. I can't give numbers, and I don't know if this was only a few times, but it is really interesting, right? That there are examples of that as well.
I guess what I was getting at was that's in contrast to the U.S., where in the old world, in the ghettos, in Dimitude, there were two streams of law. You had Jewish law, and you had the secular law, and these worked alongside each other and interacted. But in the U.S., there's one law, U.S. law, and Jewish law has become culture and custom, but has no legal enforcement.
Yeah.
Good conversation. I'm really thankful for everybody online coming in today. I really appreciate it.
Indeed.
And I will kill the recording.
Sure. Yeah.
All right.
Hopefully this was
We'll keep the meeting open.
Here we are.
That's awesome.
Okay.